In this lesson, let's talk about DOM events. So that's one of the biggest things when we're building these applications is our views need to have some way to listen for when specific actions occur. When the user clicks on a button, whether they double click on an element or if they hover over a specific div or something like that. And we can do all of that within our views much more beautifully than you might be used to using either vanilla JavaScript or regular jQuery. So what I've done for this lesson is we're kind of starting from scratch again. I have our base index page, and all we've done is we've set up our namespacing and our template helper function, and that's it. So let's build something maybe for just the most minimal form of a task tool. So the goal is we should have a form, the user will enter a task, they will click a button, and it will immediately be added to a list. And this will slowly get you into the process of how you could approach something like this. So my first step is, okay, what would be the model for a little task app? Well, a model would be one task, because that is the data we're working with, a single task. So let's do this. app.models.task equals backbone.model.extend. So in this case, let's leave the defaults empty for now, but we might want to come back later and set it. And that's an important thing to understand is what you specify as your defaults are not the only attributes or properties that can be applied. Certainly not. You can have some defaults and still use .set to add any property that you want. So for now, we're going to leave it blank. Next, we need to think of, I need a view for a specific task. So app.views.task equals, once again, backbone.view.extend. So the first thing is, what will be the tag name? Well, let's do these in an unordered list as we did before. So we'll have a list item. Next, when we call the render function, what do we want to do here? What we should do is say this.l, and we're going to set its HTML equal to this.model.get, and maybe we will call it title. We might change that later. So we're keeping it very simple right now. Whenever we call the render method on our view, what that's going to do is take a list item and populate it with the title property that's on the associated model. And remember, when we create a new instance of this task view, we're going to pass in the associated model. So let's test this out and see if it's working. We will begin by creating a new variable, and we will say var task equals a new task. And I'm going to give it some values. So we'll set the title equals go to the store. And maybe we'll set a priority or something like that. That will be 1 through 5. That's going to be a priority of 4. All right, so we have this new task. Now I want to present it. So I will say var task view equals a new. And by the way, we need to make sure we namespace this. app.models.task. Our view will be in app.views.task. And I need to make sure that I pass the associated model. So now let's view this in the browser and console.log taskView.render.l. And because I know that I want to chain this, I need to remember to follow the best practice we covered of returning this from our render method. Okay, let's switch over to index and view this in the browser. I'm going to open up Chrome Developer Tools once again. And now we do get a list item that has go to the store, and we can append that to the DOM. So now we need to have a collection view, because I need to have some view that's responsible for a collection of smaller views. So let's do that now. We'll place this at the top. We have our model. Now we will do collections.tasks equals backbone.collection.extend. I'm going to pass in the associated model. So the type of model that will be within this collection container will be of type task. And that's all we need to do for that one. So now we can change this up a little bit. We can say var tasks equals a new app.collections.tasks, and then we will pass in an array that contains all of the things we need. So there's our first model, and I will duplicate that 2 times. This next one will have a priority of 3, and that will be go to the mall. And the final one will be get to work, and that will be a priority of 5. Next, I can get rid of these 2 lines, and now we have a collections of tasks. So now that we have the collection, let's build that collection view that we talked about. app.views.tasks equals backbone.view.extend. And what we're going to do here is when we render it, we're going to do it a little bit differently from last time. And I'll demonstrate why, and you'll begin to learn more as you build these sorts of projects. What we did last time was we passed in a collection to the tasks, and we said this.collection.each, and then we passed in our model, like that. And then what we did is for each one, we created a new instance of the child view, and we appended that to the collection view's root element. And in this case, why don't we set the tag name, the root element, to be an unordered list. This time, let's change this up. Rather than putting it all within the render method, we'll say for each one, we're going to call this method called add1, and I'm also going to set the context. So now I can say this function or this method add1 needs to accept a model, and to make it more readable, rather than calling it model, maybe we will call it task. Now this add1 method will be solely responsible for creating a new child view and appending it to the root element. All right, let's do each of these one after the other. We begin by creating a new app.views.task. We're going to pass in the model, and I'm going to assign this to a variable called task view. Then we need to render it, so task view.render. And finally, we need to append it to the root element. So we could say this.l.append taskView.l. However, as we know, to save a little space, we can chain these. So instead of rendering it all in its own line, which you can do if you want, but I think it's easier just to do that. Now, these are fairly descriptive, so I don't need comments. So when we call the render method, it's going to filter through all of the items within that collection's array, essentially. And for each one, it's going to call this add1 method. And that method will create a new task view. Then we call the render method. It's going to take the model that you pass it and set its title attribute as the HTML of the list item. And then we're going to return that view. And then finally, we're going to get that root element. So we're going to get that list item, and that will be appended to the collection view's root element, which is an unordered list. All right, let's try this out and see if we made any mistakes. At the bottom, we've created our collection. And if you want, you could say tasks collection if it's easier for you to read. And now we need to create our collection view. So we'll say var tasks view equals a new app.views.tasks. And I need to make sure I pass in the collection, which is tasks collection. All right, let's try to figure out the cycle that this will go through. We begin by creating a collection. And we're going to pass in a bunch of models, which according to the way we defined the collection, will be of type task. Then we create a new tasks collection view, and we pass in the collection. So then, if we scroll up just a bit, that's not going to do anything because we don't have an initialize method that runs immediately. We're not doing that at all. You could if you wanted to, but we're not doing that. So we're only going to proceed when we call the render method on the collection view. That's going to filter through each of those items in the collection. So it will filter through each of these. And for each one, it will call this add1 method. That will create a single task view. It's going to pass in the model, and then it's going to render it. The single task view will render it by taking the title, appending it to the list item, as we discussed. And that output will then be appended to the tasks collection view root element. Say all of that 5 times. It can be confusing, but I promise if you stick with this, just keep creating this simple tasks app over and over. I know it sounds redundant, but do it 5-10 times, and you'll get to the point where you can just breeze through all of this because it makes so much sense. Let's get ready to view this in the browser now. So we've created this. We're going to run tasksView.render, and let's console.log tasksView.l and see what we get. It looks like we have one error. Maybe I forgot to do the name spacing. So let's go to line 16. And let's see, yep, model is app.models.task. The next error we have is add1 on line 23. Let's see. Of course, we want to do this.add1. Silly mistake. But now, as we would expect, we have an unordered list of all 3 list items. Excellent. So then at this point, we could have this probably within a router, which we'll discuss in the future. But for now, we can just say document.body. HTML will be tasksView.l We run it, and there we go. We have our 3 list items on the page. Maybe we can go back to index, and we'll say h1, my tasks, and then we'll have a new section here for tasks. We'll create a div there. And that could even be placed within a template as well, by the way. But we'll come back to that, and now I can say we're going to use tasks. Okay, so this looks fairly good to me. The only minor improvement maybe we can make is to render it first, and then get the element. And then I'll make sure that when we call the render method on the tasks, that we return this. Now, what I want to do here is for every single task, I want to be able to listen for a DOM event. We are just now getting to the subject of this lesson, which is listening for DOM events. So let's just do the most basic of things. How could we listen for when somebody clicks on one of these list items? Well, now that we're using Backbone, this becomes really easy. Well, we want to edit a single task view. So we would switch to that. We would go to app.views.task. We can listen for DOM events by using this Backbone events object. And this will be a little bit different. You're likely used to listening for things like get the list item, and when it is clicked, then run this function, right? That's what you're used to. Well, with Backbone, what we're going to do is we're going to specify the name of the event. So we'll say click, then with the colon, and then what are we going to do? So when that list item is clicked, what do you want to do? Well, in this case, why don't we just use a dummy method called showAlert, and we'll create that now, showAlert, and we'll say alert, you clicked me. All right, let's see if that works. I reload the page, I click on it, and wow, as easy as that, we now have a very elegant way to listen for DOM events. And even better, it's considerably more succinct, and now we know for any DOM event related to a single task, we know exactly where to go. Every single one of them will be contained within the views events object. So that's what Backbone's all about. It's all about organizing things so you have a base framework or structure to build your projects. And that way, when you come back to them 6 months down the line, it's still easy to read because every piece has its own location and function. Now, in our case, we're simply listening for a click on the root element. But what if the list item had maybe a span within it, and you wanted to listen for not a click on the full list item, but just a click on the child span? Well, then you would specify it after the event. So click span, double click on span, or mouse over. All of those things are going to be available to you. You're going to have all of the stuff that you're used to from jQuery, but you can do it in this more elegant manner. So why don't we do this? Why don't we update our task view? Because I think it needs a template. We need to have a place to add the title of the task, but then maybe we should have buttons for editing it and deleting it. So let's do that really quickly. I'm going to say template, and we're going to use our template helper function. And let's look for, what should we call this? Why don't we call it task template? Now I need to create that. So we'll do it right here within our div. It can be anywhere. It can be at the top or the bottom. So we'll say script ID equals task template, and type will be text/template. Now within here, we need to remember we don't have to add the list item itself, because if we come back, we're already going to dynamically create that through Backbone. So instead, let's just do the title of the task. And then what about 2 buttons? So maybe a button for edit and also a button for delete. We're going to be a little sloppy here, but that's okay. So we have those. Why don't we give them names? So we'll say button class equals edit. And the next one will be button class equals delete. And maybe what I also will do to give these some room if I need to target it is I will surround the title specifically within the span. And that way, if I have some special styling for my CSS, we can latch onto that without targeting everything. So now, if we go back to main.js, we have our template. So why don't we get rid of all of that? We're going to make events empty for the time being. And let's console.log this.template and say this.model.toJSON. We're going to pass in our data. we do have our templates and we have substituted the text as we would need. And maybe you want to have a priority as well. Or maybe you want to use the priority to order the tasks in terms of what's most important. We can do all of that. But for now, let's keep it as simple as we can. So at this point, we're going to say this.l.html. Rather than doing that, we'll say template equals this.template once again, this.model.toJSON. And then we'll say this.l.html should be the template. If I reload the page, now we are using our template and we have our buttons. They don't do anything yet, but we do have them. So now we can use our events to listen for when those are clicked. So the first one would be edit. How do I listen for when the edit button is clicked? Well, I would say click on the element with a class of edit. Now, what's nice about this is behind the scenes, they're not doing this. That's not what's happening. If that were the case, then we would have a much bigger DOM search, in which case it might be beneficial to maybe specify we are looking for a tag name of button. But what actually is happening is we're using the root element as the context. So what we're really doing would be something similar to our this.l.find edit. And that way we're not having to search the entire DOM tree every time, and it'll make our projects a little faster. So let's continue on. We can keep button on there, but I don't need it. We're going to listen for when the edit button is clicked, and we're going to say edit task. Let's add that now, edit task. And for now, why don't we just have an alert box, and we'll say alert, you're editing the task. Let's just make sure it's working. Reload the page, I will click edit, and yes. So now at this point, maybe we want to prompt the user because we don't really have a form here. We want to prompt the user, and I want to have the existing text for the task as the value of that prompt. So how could we grab the value of that? Well, remember this. Console.log, we still have access to the model. So if I open up Chrome DevTools again, and I click on edit, you'll see that we still have that model and we have the attributes for the task that is associated with the button that was clicked on. So then why don't we do this? Prompt, what would you like to change the text to? And we're going to set its default value to this.model.getTitle. Let's see if that works. Reload the page, I click edit, and sure enough, what would you like to change the text to? Go to the store. So now at this point, they're going to change it. Go to the grocery store. However, we are not storing that returned value. So why don't we say var new task is going to equal what is returned from that. Now, once we have this new title, we need to immediately update the model. All right, so at that point, we would say this.model.set title equal to new task title, perhaps. And that's all that this method will be responsible for. Prompt the user, get their new task, and when you have it, update the title of the model accordingly. But now we're at a point where we're not sure how to proceed. For example, if I reload the page, I'm going to click edit and we'll say go to the party, and I click OK. Well, now it has been updated, and we can confirm that if we want to. Let's come back. Let's just make that available to the window for the time being. So I will reload it, go to the party, and now if I run task collection.toJSON, we can see that the first one, yeah, it has been updated. So now we need a different kind of event. We need a custom event listener. We need a way to say, all right, whenever a model is updated or changed in any way, when the title is changed or the priority is changed, we need a way for the view to listen for that and then immediately re-render the view whenever it's changed. And we're going to discuss that in the next lesson.